That was John. That's toxic, but that was John. In-law apologizing for the murders, but that he had no options left. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today we're gonna do another true crime and makeup video. We're gonna do it a little bit different. As you can see, I've already done my makeup and I'm just gonna sit here and just tell the story. I've seen a couple people, you know, kind of switch back and forth between doing their makeup and not doing their makeup. I really tried to do my makeup. I started filming this video and I started my makeup and I was like, I can't focus. So because of that, we're gonna go ahead and tell the story while we're not doing our makeup. This story is also a little bit long, but I don't want the video to be as long as the last one. So now that I'm done talking, we're gonna get into the case. John Emil List was born in Bay City, Michigan on September 17th, 1925 to John Frederick and Alma List, who were cousins. Frederick was 2 decades older than Alma, and he married her after his first wife passed away from cancer. Alma was actually the nurse while his first wife was in hospice. And throughout John's childhood, when it came to his father, John, he was an afterthought. I'll get to it when I get to it. Like about your kid, right? It's said that when Frederick had the family home remodeled, they built a apartment above the garage, like a little attic apartment that they could rent out to tenants, but they never built a room for John, and so he ended up sleeping on the couch throughout his entire childhood. It's not that your parents don't have the money, it's not that they don't have the resources, they just don't want to. Frederick would only refer to John as the boy, and he never really built a relationship with his son. The only thing that Frederick did pass down to John was his hard work ethic and his strict adherence to the Lutheran faith. In Frederick's view, a man's true purpose was to work long hours, and you're only as good as your last paycheck. That's really all you can do. You can work, go to church. John's father thought that accepting any type of outside assistance, financially or otherwise, meant that you just were not a man. It's rumored that even during the Great Depression, the entire city of Bay City, Michigan, refused help from any outside government entity simply out of pride. Now, faith made Frederick a very dull boy, okay, and he would also pass that along to John. John would pathologically follow any direction that he was given, and he was especially obedient of his mother. He only got in trouble twice in his whole life, once for being rowdy in church and then again for running in the house. And other than that, he was just like the perfect child. You know how people say you want a child who's quiet and obedient and only speaks when they are spoken to? That was John. That's toxic, but that was John. And his only social interaction outside of the home was when he was at church. And even when his school teacher asked him why he wouldn't play with the other kids, he was like,
"Oh no, I can't. Mommy doesn't want me to get dirty."
I don't know where the British accent came from, but we gonna roll with it. But John seemed to have this sort of like superiority about him, like always following the rules and always doing what he's told. So because of this, like nobody really paid much attention to John. People didn't like him very much. He wasn't very popular at all. He graduated from high school in 1943 and he joined the army, and he was stationed in Louisiana, where his fellow servicemen would later describe him as a prissy. Well, 1944, Frederick, his father, dies, okay? Kicks the bucket. And this doesn't really seem to bother John at all. I mean, it's not like they really had like this great thriving relationship. And so it was said that John left the military and went to his father's funeral and then came back home. And during his father's funeral, it's said that he had the enthusiasm of running a slightly inconvenient errand. 1945 comes around and John is shipped to Europe as part of the final stage infantry campaign against the Nazis. His team was quickly captured by the Nazis, but because this was like the last few weeks of the war, the Nazis were like, yeah, this ain't really worth it, so we just gonna let you go, and they surrendered to the American soldiers. Now, because of this, John did get a Bronze Star in the military, but from everything I read, it seems like a Bronze Star is really just like a participation award. But John was really proud of this. Like, I went to the military, I got me a Bronze Star, look at me, I'm doing so amazing, right? After that, John goes home, and after being overseas for a total of 34 days, mostly spent in transit from one place to another, he consulted his mother with what he should do with the rest of his life. Like, what now? Like, I went to school, I went to the military, what do I do now? And so they decided together that he was gonna go to the University of Michigan and study business to become an accountant. And John quickly learned in his schooling that this was his life's passion. This is everything he ever wanted to be, like a real accountant. Like, I calculate numbers for a living, not like, you know, an accountant. John becomes an accountant, and he would frequently write letters to his mother telling her how great of a time he's having and how he has all these wonderful friends. But in reality, nobody really paid attention to John. He didn't really have any friends. Like, people didn't even really remember him, and he would never go visit his mother. But his mother would take the 3-hour train ride to spend the weekend with her son in his dorm room. Feels a little sus to me, but okay. And so after 4 years, John graduated with a B average, and he became an accountant in Detroit. When the Korean War came, John was called back to duty and was stationed in Virginia, and he spent most of his times just touring the battlegrounds and going to church functions. And in September of 1941, he met his future wife. And so Helen was physically abused throughout her childhood, and as a teen she ran away from home and she married a soldier named Marvin in 1941. Marvin was soon shipped off to war, and the next year Helen gave birth to a daughter that they named Brenda. During childbirth, the doctor ended up splashing ether into Helen's eyes. Now, I know that you're wondering, because I was wondering what the fuck is ether, because I've never heard of that. But ether is an unpleasant smelling, colorless, volatile liquid that is highly flammable. It is used as an anesthetic and as a solvent or intermediate in industrial processes. Now, when you get to the solvent and intermediate, I don't know what you're talking about, but I know what volatile liquid and highly flammable means, and I don't feel like that's something that you should have in your eyes. So due to this destroyed Helen's peripheral vision, and it also made her eyes bulge from her head. Marvin did survive the war, and in 1947 he was shipped off to Korea, where he soon got syphilis, and then of course immediately, because you got to share everything with your spouse, you know, what's yours is mine, what's mine is yours, so he passed that little syphilis on to Helen. And Helen started showing symptoms almost immediately, but since the soldiers were all coming home, they were like,
yeah, see, we gotta give it to our boys, cause the boys who's on the front lines, they need it more than you do.
So Helen was denied the simple round of penicillin that would have cleared her syphilis. By the time the treatment was available to her, the disease had already ravaged her body. She was already blind in her right eye, and the disease was already slowly eating away at her brain. Marvin was killed in action in 1951, and according to Brenda, Helen took this really hard. And after a string of dead relationships, Helen decided that she wanted to marry John after 8 months after Marvin's death. Now, Helen's sister Jean and Jean's husband Gene, they weren't too fond of John. They were like, he's kind of boring. Gene, the husband, would later say that John was a loser from the word go. John's mother, Alma, also was not a fan of Helen, and she called her a dirty rebounder. But regardless of all of this, 2 months after the two started dating, Helen announced to John that she was pregnant, that she was with child, and John did what he thought was right. He had to marry Helen and make an honest woman out of her. And so once the deal was all said and done, Helen let him know.
You know that pregnancy I was talking about, like before when I said I was pregnant? Well, like, not really. But, like, now we're married. Like, it's so great. Like, now we're married, and, like, we can have a baby for real this time.
And this was really upsetting to John. But because he thought that marriage was such a sacred thing, this was his woman and he gonna stick beside her. So John starts this pattern of giving in to his wife's will and pushing down his feelings again and again. By 1954, John and Helen moved to a suburb of Detroit and they had their first child, for real this time. They named her Patricia. Her nickname was Patty. Jean, Helen's sister, said that Helen didn't even really like kids. Like, she was not a fan of children at all, and she found her brood to be a burden to her. Meanwhile, John found a more prosperous job in Kalamazoo. In Kalamazoo, the list had 2 more children, John Jr. and Fred. And John became the treasurer at his local church, just like his father was. And he was so proud of this position. He was so proud of his accomplishment. Babe, look at this thing I did. And Helen's like,
yeah, I don't give a fuck. And I don't want to go to church anymore. So
Helen stops going to church shortly after she gives birth to John Jr. After that, her daughter Brenda quickly followed suit and stopped going to church as well. And John just found this really disrespectful. So once Helen stopped going to church, she started to drink a lot. And when she began to drink heavily, she would tease John about being a goody little two shoes. And John, however, would never argue, he would never fight, he wouldn't raise his voice, he wouldn't even have a conversation with his wife about the escalating harassment. And so he would just sit and sulk, and the resentment would build. Helen, outside of drinking, was also taking tranquilizers, particularly thalidomide is how I think I say it. I'm gonna put it on the screen somewhere around here and y'all let me know if I said it right. But thalidomide was widely used as a drug in the 1950s and 60s for the treatment of nausea in pregnant women. It became apparent in the 1960s that thalidomide treatment resulted in severe birth defects in thousands of children. So they vetoed that real quick. But Helen did not. This, combined with her drinking and her worsening syphilis, Helen withdrew from the world and slowly began to lose her mind. Helen would leave all the lights on in the house day and night, and the neighbors would look into their windows and see Helen vacuuming at 3 a.m. Like, is that weird? Because I clean at 3 a.m. So Helen rarely went out during the day, and she didn't speak to any of the neighbors, but what she was materialistic, okay? She was a material girl. And she insisted that her and the children have to have the best clothes, the best shoes, the best accessories, but nobody ever saw any of these expensive things because no one was allowed in the List home except for Jean and Jean. Helen would also harass John at work. She would call the office and say,
hey babe, what you doing? Are you working? Oh, okay. Well,
your son just shit his pants. And if you want him changed, then you can come home and do it yourself.
In true John fashion, he would drop everything he was doing, drive home, change the baby, come back to work, and just go about his day. This was just really humiliating to John, and it really took a shot at his ego. But again, he not gonna say nothing. I'ma just do me and I'm not gonna say nothing. She would even bully John, telling him that he was nothing compared to Marvin. John's favorite game to play was called Third Reich, and he would always insist on playing the Nazis. Had to be Nazi no matter what. And John was also an obsessive right-winger who believed the moral fabric of society was disintegrating right before his very eyes. And all of the Democrats were communists, hell-bent on destroying America. Because the home life was just so miserable, Brenda moved out when she was 18. She married and divorced 3 times before she finally settled down. And instead of wondering why his stepdaughter would prefer to hop from marriage to just living in the house with her actual family, well, John decides that this is just Brenda's lack of morals. And he vowed that his daughter Patty would not end up like that. But life never seemed to really work out for John the way that he wanted it to. Soon, John's job was bought out and he was fired because he didn't have any managerial skills, and this pattern would continue in his life. He was obsessed with appearing to be the perfect family man and his social status, but he wouldn't even tell his family when he got fired. When John didn't have a job, he would get up every morning, have breakfast, get dressed, go to the train station, take another train to another train station, and then just sit in the train station all day, just reading newspapers. And after 8 hours of reading the newspaper, he would get back on the train and go back home and act like, hey honey, I had a great day at work. Eventually, he did get another job with a very good salary, 6 figures in today's money, but because of Helen's expensive taste, John was constantly in debt, and he fell for the trap that is corporate America. He thought that all of his money problems would be solved if he could just work hard and move up in the company. He was promoted to director of accounting in 1962, and he was placed in charge of 4 managers and 260 people. But John wasn't built for the manager life. He wasn't built to be talking to people and telling people what to do. He wasn't built for all that. He was just a worker bee, okay? And anytime he would have to speak publicly, his face would turn bright red and he would break out in hives. And when he did finally get the courage to speak, he would sway back and forth. He would also trip over his words and his face would twitch. He also couldn't put on like the family man attitude that was needed for corporate America. When there were family functions that he was forced to bring his mess of a wife to, Helen would spend the party flirting with all the men and telling the women, oh, you don't have to be so uptight. She would tell all of John's co-workers how he could never measure up to her first husband, Marvin. So John, now 40 in 1965, was out of time in his mind. His whole life had passed him by, and the country was going to shit. All of it is crumbling right before his very eyes. He was rigid and timid and overly proud of his very sad life. And Helen was entering the early stages of cerebral atrophy, which is when the brain shrinks. By 1966, Helen was in and out of hospitals constantly. Her legs got so stiff that she couldn't walk, and she once fractured her skull during a drinking spell when she was blackout drunk. Meanwhile, the higher ups at John's company told him that he had gone, you did as much as you can do. You've gone as far as you can go. So after that job, John got another job at a bank in Jersey City as a vice president. Now this would be John's last lateral move. For this job, the family was relocated to Westfield, New Jersey, and Helen insisted that they buy the most expensive house in town. Eventually, they settled on a house that cost about $57,000, which was twice their original budget, still half of what it would even cost to buy a small 2-bedroom house here in America in today. 431 Hillside Avenue was a 3-story mansion with 19 rooms, 10 fireplaces, and 5 bathrooms. So the house was actually a money pit and it needed a lot of repairs, and to afford it, John asked his mom for a loan. And she said, yeah, baby, I'll give you a loan. Of course, anything for my darling boy. But if I'm gonna give you this loan, I'm gonna need a room in your house. So John agreed and he moved in his mother. And in the letters to her friends, Alma would write that her time in this house was the unhappiest of her life. When the family moved in, a neighbor tried to bring over a tray of cookies. You know, hi neighbor, I'm bringing you cookies. And John was like, yeah, no, like it's simply not in his customs to socialize with the neighbors. So that cemented John and his family's reputation as a fuddy-duddy. And John was seen as John was seen as an overly strict grouch. So much so that he was asked not to teach Sunday school anymore. When people would come to the List home, it barely had any furniture, and Helen would present no hospitality. And after 1 year in Jersey, John was fired from his job, and of course, his family was never told. He would go to the train station and for months pretending to be working, and he would supplement his income by stealing from his mother's bank account. Finally, he got another job, but the salary was only half of what he previously made at the bank. So the next year, John's job was relocated, and again, he was forced out of a job. Helen, meanwhile, was still drinking and still spending money and berating John. And he allowed this because he thought this was the only way to truly keep Helen happy. But like, is she happy? As far as the children went, John became more and more strict and tried to keep them from losing their morality, according to him. Then, when Helen fell bedridden, the children basically just took care of themselves, and John took care of Helen day and night. Helen would ask John to hire a nurse, but he refused and said that that was just too expensive. And when Helen would suggest that he apply for welfare, John looked at her like she was the scum of the earth and refused. The kids at the time were between 13 and 16 years old. John Jr. was described as the type of person to stick a pencil in your ribs just to see your reaction. And Fred was described as cute and cuddly, and the eldest, Patricia, was going through her biggest transformation. The year was 1970, and Patty found a love for the theater. And her father was like, yeah, no. He said it is a field for the devil, and even compared acting to prostitution. Patty would go to church and tell her friends that she was becoming a witch. Go off, sis. And the worst thing Patty ever did was going walking and smoking with her friends. Patty was picked up by the police, and when John came to pick her up, he was freshly shaven with a fresh suit and tie on. It's even said once Patty was caught wearing a thin cotton t-shirt that said "Make love, not war," period. John pushed his daughter against the wall, ripped her shirt off, and called her and Helen sluts. After this, Patty and John just stopped talking to each other altogether. By the summer of 1971, John was in insurance, and he was making about $5,000 a year. He had 3 mortgages on his house totaling $50,000. The heating bill was $1,000, and he had a tab with the milkman of $150. The final straw came when the house came under foreclosure. John faced bankruptcy, and his family had no idea about any of this. Faced with financial ruin and a family he didn't even like, John just, he started looking for, you know, some other options. He just wanted to see what else was out there, and he wanted to know, you know, what, you know, how do we fix this? How do we fix the situation that we're in? So divorce was not an option according to his beliefs, and he couldn't unalive himself because that was a one-way ticket to hell. He thought about just killing Helen, but he knew that his mother was too old to take care of the children, and the children would be traumatized forever. And now, of course, the realistic option of gaining welfare and declaring bankruptcy was always on the table, but in John's mind, that was a fate worse than death. And he couldn't abandon his family because then they would drift away from the church, essentially damning them all to hell. And since Helen was dying, leaving them would just be condemning them to poverty. Like, it's not gonna work. So John settled on the only option that would allow him an out, save his family's souls, and then he could just ask God for forgiveness. John went to the Westfield police office about a month before his plan would take action. And he filled out a firearm permit application, which required him to leave his fingerprints. But he never picked up the application. 2 weeks prior to the event, John uncharacteristically allowed Patty to have a Halloween party in one of the ballrooms of the home with her drama club friends. So while Patty was with her friends enjoying the party, they just getting down, John stood over the landing and he just watched them. He just stared down at them. At one point in the party, John sees another boy either kissing a girl, smoking, or drinking. He saw him doing something he wasn't allowed to do in his house. And so instead of just saying something, instead of being like, hey, let's not do that, he runs down the stairs, goes over to the boy and tries to kick him. But instead of kicking him, he misses and he falls in front of all of these high schoolers. How embarrassing. So after this humiliation, John moved to the next phase of his plan, which was telling his victims what was going to happen. So John sat the kids down at the kitchen table and he informed them that they would soon die by his hand. The reason that he told them was so he could ask the children if they wanted to be buried or if they wanted to be cremated. And each one of them said that they wanted to be buried. And once the kids gave their preference, John just silently left the room and locked himself in his office. But the List children didn't keep this on the low. Like, they wasn't, oh, okay, cool. Like, there wasn't like something going on. Like, they were like, hey,
we need help. Somebody help us, please.
During Patty's next drama class lesson with her drama teacher, Ed Iliano, Patty told him that her father was going to kill her. And when Ed told her that she was exaggerating, Patty got angry and she was like,
no, I know he's going to kill us. He told us he's going to kill us.
Soon after, Ed was driving Patty home from school. Why a teacher was driving a student home, I don't know. When Ed arrived at the home, he was pulled to the side by the middle child, John Jr., and he said,
you know, you can come out whenever you want. You know, whenever you're in the neighborhood, you're always welcome here.
Ed said that John had quiet hysteria in his voice. Okay, when he returned to the car, he saw John List staring out the window. He's just staring daggers at him. Like, can you get out of here? You gonna fuck everything up. Monday, November 8th. Patty called Ed again.
Begged him to come over. Please come over. Please, 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 please come over right now.
And we don't know why she asked him to come over, but Ed was just, he was tired. He had worked all day, he was tired, and he wasn't super comfortable with going over there. I mean, after last time with them kids acting crazy, I get it. No, I'm kidding, you should have said something. But little did anyone know that that night was the night that John decided to go through with his plan the following day. So even though John had made the decision the night before, he had still been planning this for months. And he had even circled the date, November 9th, on his calendar. Now, John's prep work was more about his escape rather than the act itself. So a few days prior, John went and he canceled the newspaper deliveries because we can't have newspapers piling up. The day of the murders, John here's a newspaper being delivered.
What the fuck is that? What is this?
And so the newspaper's being delivered, and so annoyed, he goes and he gets the newspaper and he's like, ugh, I gotta remember to do this at the end of the day. Let them know no more goddamn newspapers. When he read the paper that day, it just gave him the confirmation that he needed, that he was doing the right thing, okay? And so there was an article about a bill that mandated prayer, said you have to pray in school, that got vetoed. And he was just so upset. And then he saw a picture for the book Helter Skelter next to a picture of Manson's face. And then he sees an ad saying the best-selling book of the entire year is The Exorcist. So at 8:30, the milkman came by to drop off the list weekly delivery of milk, butter, and eggs. And the milkman found a note stating to stop the deliveries until further notice because the family was on vacation. With the kids already off to school, John decided now was his time. Around 9 a.m., they did not interact with each other. She gets her coffee, she sits down, she takes a sip. And then John pulls out his pistol, aims it about 18 inches away from her head. John pulled the trigger and shot her in the jaw. Helen fell to the floor and blood began pouring from her face. But she wasn't dead yet. So John shot several more times to make sure his wife was gone. John then ran upstairs to the third floor kitchen where his mother, Alma, was having her coffee. So John walks into the room without knocking for the first time ever in his life. And Alma's like, what?
What's all the noise about? What's going on down there?
And without saying a word, John raised his pistol to his mother's head and shot her right above the left eye at point blank range. John then rolled Alma's body in a carpet and dragged it down the hallway where it was crammed into a small utility room. After handling his mother, John returned to Helen. He grabbed her by the ankles and dragged her into the ballroom, leaving a 40-foot streak of blood behind him, leading to the kitchen. John, in a misguided idea of kindness, left sleeping bags for each of his family members in the middle of the floor. John arranged her on the sleeping bag and then went to clean up the blood streak. He then walked up to Helen's room to wipe his hands on her bed sheets. And then he laid in her bed convulsing, was what I read. And then he ran into the bathroom to vomit, leaving a bloody handprint on the toilet. John then composed himself, showered, and put on a fresh suit and tie. John was due for a 10 a.m. meeting with his boss, but he called and canceled and said that he was going to visit his sick mother-in-law in North Carolina. He then called the kids' school with the same excuse, saying that they would be out of town for a while until the emergency passed. Then, for the last time, John went out and raked the leaves in his front yard for the very last time. At noon, John's plans hit a snag. Patty called, and she said that she wasn't feeling well and she needed him to come pick her up. So annoyed, John goes to go pick up Patty, and then he brings her home and he rushes inside while she's gathering her books. So she's gathering her books, and she goes in, she follows him inside into the laundry room. As soon as the door closes, John raised his pistol to the back of her head and shot her at point blank range, making Patty the first and only victim who didn't see it coming. Her body was dragged to the ballroom, leaving another 40-foot blood streak and laid next to her mother. By 3 p.m., John had showered and changed his clothes again, and then he was back to his errands. He cashed an $85 check at the bank, and he went to the post office where he mailed letters to his children's school and filled out a form to have the mail delivery stopped. Next, he went to another bank and he cashed a check into his mother's account, which drained all of her $200 she had left, and he cashed 2 savings bonds for $2,000. By 3 p.m., his youngest son, Fred, had arrived to his after-school job where he learned that Patty went home sick. And so because they said Fred was just such a sweetheart and he just had such a sweet soul, he wanted to go home to help take care of his sister. So he calls John.
Hey, John, come pick me up.
So again, annoyed, John picked up Fred. He drove home in silence and he rushed in the home before him. This time, however, John faced Fred as he raised the gun and fired a single fatal shot and dragged the youngest boy's body into the ballroom. Following that murder, John's plan was almost discovered by the last member of the family, John Jr. John Jr. was supposed to be at soccer practice, but soccer practice was canceled because of the unseasonably cold weather. John Sr. spotted his son coming up the path. When John Jr. walked in the door, he immediately saw the blood and saw his father raise the gun. He was able to dodge the first blast, but all that this meant was that the bullet hit John Jr. in his back instead of his head. As he dropped to the floor wounded, John Sr. fired again, but John Jr. still didn't die. So John Jr. was crawling across the floor in an attempt to escape, and John Sr. pulled out a second handgun and started shooting at the boy Wild West style. Just... By the end, John had shot his middle son 10 times. He then dragged the body into the ballroom and laid the body next to his siblings and his mother. 3 of them were all lined up. 1 was perpendicular. So John immediately dropped to his knees and started praying for forgiveness. And at 7 p.m., he called his pastor, Reverend Eugene A. Raywinkle, at the Lutheran church. John called Ed Eliano, Patty's drama teacher, to tell him the same story, that Patty would be unavailable to play the alternate in the school performance of A Streetcar Named Desire that was supposed to come in the following weeks. He then sat down and wrote letters to his mother-in-law apologizing for the murders, but that he felt like he had no options left. Next, he wrote basically the same letters to Helen's sister Jean and his mother's sister Lydia. He then wrote a letter to his boss apologizing about how he quit. Lastly, he wrote the longest letter to his pastor explaining his behavior and asking for forgiveness. John also mentioned in these letters that his children had requested to be cremated, which they did not, and that it had to be done as cheaply as possible. He also asked that he be dropped from the members list at his church. This had to be what God wanted because he never answered his prayers regarding his family or his children. Finally, he added postscript, "Mother is upstairs in the hallway. She was too heavy." After writing all the letters, John made dinner. Then he slept till just before dawn. And then he turned on every light in the house except the ballroom. He then removed himself from all of the family photos and fed Helen's fish. Lastly, he lowered the temperature to the home to prevent the neighbors from detecting a smell, essentially putting the bodies on ice in an unseasonably cold November. John's last errand in town was to drop off a letter at Patty and Fred's after-school job, letting them know that they would be out of town on an emergency and unavailable. And then he would drive to the JFK airport, park in the long-term parking lot, and disappear for the next 18 years. It would be a month before the family would be discovered. But it wasn't until November 20th, the day of the Streetcar Named Desire performance, that Patty's drama club friends really started to worry about her. And that was 11 days after the murder. John, again, had left every single light on in the home, but since the list were considered weirdos and strange people, we don't really worry about that. But that was until the lights started going out one by one. The schools were also asking questions, and Ed Eliano asked the police if they could go to the home and do a welfare check, and the police were like, nah. Finally, on December 5th, Ed went to the family home. He drove to their house and searched the windows until he found the one that was open. He went into the home and he looked around the home until he came upon the dead bodies, and then he fled to his car and just kind of went home. He didn't call the police. He didn't do anything. According to Ed, it was very disturbing and overwhelming, and it just took him 2 days to come to terms with just what his eyeballs witnessed. and he just never went to the police. In those 2 days, he did decide that he was going to go back to the list home, but this time he made a lot of noise when he was breaking in, and so because of this, the neighbors thought that the house was being burglarized, so they called the police. When the police finally entered the home, they found that John had left his favorite classical music playing on the highest volume over the house's intercom system. 4 days later, his car was found in the JFK parking lot, but there was no evidence of what happened to him past that. He went to JFK and poof, disappeared. In 1971, this was the crime of the century in New Jersey, and the police chief put everything he had into finding John. But it was obvious that John had fled Jersey, so the FBI also got involved. Shortly after the 1-year anniversary of the murder, someone burned down the List home. John List laid low for a few months reading his Bible and his historical novels, and he really thought that the police were gonna come and get him like a week after the murder. Like, he thought he had no time. He probably had like a week to do whatever, but he didn't really anticipate having longer than that. So after that, after nobody said anything and he wasn't on the news, then he was just like, well, I'm gonna just keep living my life. So he bought a trailer just outside of Denver for about $1,500, and he was just kind of living his life. He worked as a cook at a Holiday Inn. He worked as a night cook while he was able to accumulate things for his trailer, you know, stove, couch, fridge. And people would say that John was a quiet but friendly man who would flinch when anyone would curse. Imagine working in a kitchen and not liking cursing. He was soon promoted to short line cook, and he took a job as a sous chef at a country club, also in Denver. He would later say that he had no issues handling the pressure of the kitchen, I assume because the pressure of your life is kind of gone. It was even rumored that they added one of his original recipes to the menu at this country club that he was at, like a permanent menu item. And by 1977, he decided that he was done being a chef and he wanted to return to his true original passion, which was accounting. So he started an accounting consulting firm, which was pretty much a failure, and the only thing that really kept this business going was a woman, his only client. Her name was Dolores Miller, and Dolores would say that she didn't really like John at first. Like, he's nice, but that's about it. But she said that he was persistent, and so eventually the two became a couple. She would frequently float him money to keep his business going. Soon he got another job as an office manager for another company called the All Packaging Company. And by 1978, John and Dolores got married. So John, Dolores, they get married shortly after John was fired from the All Packaging Company, because you know that's how his life goes. He felt like the pattern was just starting all over. It was just the same shit, different day. And he didn't have any money to pretend to be working, so this time he just sat around the house in his suit and tie reading the weekly want ads, while Dolores floated all her money and poured all of her money into this little business that wasn't going anywhere. So while John was home, he started to kind of chat with one of the neighbors, Wanda Flannery. And Wanda really felt sorry for John. She just saw him sit around the house all day in his suit and tie, and it was just like really sad and pathetic. And so she started to ask him questions like, where are you from? What do you do? Like, what's going on? And the only thing he would ever say about his past life was that
my wife died. She was very sick. It was very tragic.
Then in February 1987, Wanda picked up an issue of the Weekly World News, and this was like a newspaper that like wasn't a regular newspaper. Like, they talked about true crime and like aliens and conspiracies and all of that, right? So Wanda saw the story A Perfect Crime, and right next to the story A Perfect Crime was a picture of John List's face, and she immediately knew that's Bob Clark was his name. And so she goes to Dolores and she's like,
this is your boy, like John, like this guy right here, like this is also your boy Bob Clark.
And she's like,
yeah, okay. He's telling me that my Bob can be a murderer. My Bob's a mass murderer. Okay.
And she just kind of dismissed the whole thing and just kind of let it go. Around the same time, Captain Frank in Westfield, New Jersey, I had his last name. I lost his last name. I'm not sure what happened. I'm so sorry, Captain Frank. Captain Frank got a hold of America's Most Wanted. But they said that the story was too old and the trail was too cold for them to do anything. Mind you, now this is 1987. And so Frank, he was like, I'm not gonna give up, I'm gonna go to everybody. And so he goes to Unsolved Mysteries, and they tell him the same thing. And finally, he works really, really hard to get this in front of somebody. So he finally gets to pitch the case to the producers of America's Most Wanted, and his pitch worked great because they were like, yeah, let's do it, even though they previously said no. And John List was an avid watcher of America's Most Wanted, okay? And sure enough, on May 21st, 1989, John saw a recreation of his own face on the show. They made like this like sculpture thing. I'll put a picture. It's really creepy. But they made this 3D sculpture of what he would look like. He looked just a little bit older, a little bit fatter, but you could clearly see that this is John List. Like that night, the show got 250 calls, and one of those calls was Wanda Flannery. And she said,
"This is the address he's staying at. This is the name that he's going by. Please come pick this man up."
And so the police come, and within 2 weeks, the police are in John's driveway, and he surrendered without a fight. Dolores later said when being asked by the FBI that she didn't know that he was John List. She was like,
"I don't even know who John List is, and like he's not my husband because my husband is the nicest man in the world."
So John's fingerprints were closely matched to the fingerprint that John had left when he filed for that handgun permit back in Jersey. And so he never picked up the permit, so they was like, this has got to be him. So still, it took almost a year for John to drop the whole Bob Clark